Morning, everybody. Thank you all so much for being here today on such a beautiful Saturday. My name is Rachel. I work with the town of Southern Pines. Before we get started, I did just want to recognize and thank our nonprofit partners who assisted with putting this clinic together. So if y'all would want to introduce yourselves, I'll start with Farah from Habitat.
Hello, everyone. My name is Farah Newman, and I am the Programs Director with Habitat for Humanity of the NC Sandhills. Thank you for coming.
And then we have Nina.
Morning, I'm Nina Walker. I'm Executive Director of Sandhills Community Action Program, and thank you for coming this morning.
And then we have Sandra.
Good morning. My name is Sandra Dales. I'm the Executive Director of the Southern Pines Land and Housing Trust, and I'm so excited to be here today.
So I want to say thank you to all of our nonprofit partners for helping put this clinic together. Thank you everybody again for coming out today. So just a quick overview of the agenda. We're going to have Mr. Gary Briggs with the Moore County Tax Department present, and then we're going to have a Q&A session for about 30 minutes. I do want to let you all know that we are live streaming this. The camera's in the back of the room. So whenever we do Q&A, I'll take around the microphone to everybody. Please raise your hand if you have questions and then ask your questions on the microphone so the live stream can pick up your voice. So with that being said, I do want to give a special thank you to the Moore County Tax Department. Thank you so much for being here today. And with that being said, I'll turn it over to Gary Briggs. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. So first of all, we appreciate the opportunity to come talk with everyone today. What I want to do this morning, before I even get started, is I've got some other members of our staff here that are available. We've got Mike Howery, who is our division leader. He's there in the back. He oversees all of our listing and assessing. We have Stanley Lynn, who is an appraiser in our appraisal department there. And then on the right side of the room, we have Laura Denning. She oversees all the exemptions, exclusions, and applications for some benefit programs that sometimes people qualify. So what I hope to do here today is I'm going to walk you through a little bit of a description of what the tax department does, give you kind of a quick snapshot of the scope and scale of what we do annually, then move into talking about the reevaluation that I'm sure everyone here is aware of for 2023. Explain the who, what, when, why, how of a reevaluation. Then I'm going to walk through a discussion involving what's called tax neutral rate. And that's probably something that most people are going to be interested in because that ultimately translates into a tax bill. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the process that you can go through if you have a question or concern. It's called an appeals process of your property value. And we're currently, that's why Mr. Howery and Mr. Lynn are in the back there. Following our presentation and Q&A, you can certainly go talk with them. They've got access to information. We try to bring everything self-contained to be able to answer questions as best we can. And then, of course, you can also take time to talk with Ms. Denning if you have a question or an interest to learn if someone you know or yourself is eligible maybe for a program that could exclude or exempt some of your taxes. So with that being said, I've got a slideshow here that kind of assists me as I go along. So the first thing I want to talk about is, well, what does the tax department actually do? So there's 4 fundamentals that we do on an annual basis. We list, we assess, we bill, and we collect taxes. So this is the same for all taxes. So what I mean by that, when I say listing, we list all real property, make sure that we have all the information correct in our system and that we have it recorded so that we properly know what's there. This would also include, which is outside of the reevaluation, but it would include personal property that you own. Maybe you own a boat, a utility trailer, those kind of things that need to be listed. It would also include business personal property, which is property owned by a business that's used in the generation of revenue or income. Those are taxable assets. In addition, it includes motor vehicles. I know we have tax and tag in North Carolina, but if there's a question or concern about the value, which is established at the state level of that motor vehicle, the local tax department handles that question. And so after we get through the listing process every year, we then move on to what's called the assessment side, meaning we have to place a value or have a value established for those assets. Every year, personal property motor vehicle values, they are they're reevaluated every year because they have a higher depreciation rate, and it's much different than real property. But for real property, we make sure that any new property construction, any changes to existing property, that we have all that information and that we can reassess that property properly in line with the statutes and the processes that we follow. After we've established the assessment side, we move into, and this is generally in the mid to late July, the billing cycle, where we try to have everything assessed, and then we can apply the rates that have been determined by either the county, or if you're in a town, the county and the town entities, apply those rates and generate you a bill. That bill would be mailed out the last week in July. The reason being, one thing that is still a benefit in Moore County, the county itself still offers a 2% discount rate on your real property and your taxes if you pay that by August 31st. Just something we always like people to be aware of. And then, of course, after we've done the billing, we do the collection. We provide that service of billing and collecting for 7 of the 9 municipalities and for the entire county. So when we collect the money, we simply redistribute it back to the cities as a function. We do the assessment, the listing, assessing, billing, and collecting for all 7 of those municipalities. And the 2 that we don't do the billing and collecting for are Foxfire and Pine Bluff. They choose to do that component themselves. To put in scope and scale of the size of operation that we do, there's over 74,000 parcels in Moore County as of this current date. There's 37,000 of those parcels have a residential structure on them where people live, and it can be anything from a townhome to a condo to a single-family resident or multifamily resident, but it's a spread across the whole thing. We have a little over 3,100 properties that are identified as commercial. Now, not all of those have structures on them, but they're deemed to be, maybe it could be a parking lot in front of a store or something, but they are deemed commercial properties, and that changes the way we look at them and set in value. We break all of these properties down, all 74,000 properties, down into what we call tax neighborhoods. Now, not to be confused with if you live in a gated community and I'll just say Pinewald. You live in Pinewald. Within Pinewald, there are sections of tax neighborhoods. So when we use the word tax neighborhood, it may not be what the public generally thinks of their neighborhood. And it's grouping together of like and kind properties, size, type of structures, those kind of things. But that's how we break those down. So what does a real property tax value represent? Make sure I'm on the same slide. So the real property tax assessment value that we have just put on with a revaluation that I'm going to talk more about in a minute, that is a value that if someone were to take their property and put a for sale sign on it, what would they sell it for? What would it be sold? Now, I know that a lot of people would say, well, I'm not looking to sell my property. Understood. You may be in your forever home. But we are tasked with the job of setting a market value to that property for the purposes that taxation value is used for. And so basically, a real property tax value represents the market value of that piece of property as of the date of the last reassessment. So currently in 2023, this is a revaluation year. January 1st of any year that is a reassessment year or revaluation year is considered the effective date. So the tax assessment values that everyone received notice here recently, I think we mailed them out in third week in March, represents what we, the tax department, after reviewing thousands and thousands of points of data, believe that the market value of that property was. All right? And so the key thing to remember is we have collected for the last 4 years since the prior revaluation, which was effective for 1/1/2019, we've collected all the information involving cost data, sales that took place, and any other factor that could be involved in helping to establish and understand what a property is and then placing that market value on it. It's a pretty big undertaking, and it takes multiple years to put one together. So to define simply what a market value is, I told it's the price a piece of property would sell for on that effective date. But more importantly, it is the value if a willing buyer and a willing seller come to an agreement to sell property, with neither of the parties being under any kind of duress or pressure. It's called an arm's length transaction. If I decided to sell a piece of property to someone, I didn't know them, but I listed it, It includes just the house, just the land, nothing else. It doesn't include furniture. It doesn't include anything else. It's a straightforward transaction. That is defining, when I sell it for that amount, then that's a willing market value transaction. It's important to know that because you can see sales sometimes, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. If I were to sell a property to my brother, I might not charge him what the full market value is because I'm going to take care of my family just like anyone else would. If I bought a house on the lake and the guy said, yeah, I don't need the boat anymore, I'm moving to Arizona. Well, then the boat would be included as a component, and that would not be considered market value because the boat's a part of it, not just the real property. So it's important just to understand in simplistic terms what that is. So I don't spend a lot of time on the next two slides, but I like people just to think a little bit. So when we're valuing raw land, some of the characteristics that we look at, I've got listed up here on the screen. Of course, we've got the size, shape, location, zoning, all those factors. But each piece of property has to be evaluated and then an assessment value placed on it based on to its own characteristics. You may have two pieces of property side by side and one has tremendous topo issues. That could affect the value that would be different, even though it's the same size and shape of the one next to it. So there's a lot of factors that go into establishing value for raw land. The next thing is if you have an improvement on it. When I say improvement, a structure or something built onto the land, these are just some of the many things. Everyone knows that if you have a house, well, when was the house built? What condition is it in? Is it in a location that's more advantageous than others? But these are just some of the many, many things that go into when we're setting values on real property and structures. So in 2023, of course, is a revaluation year. What a revaluation is where the tax department goes back and takes all the data we've collected for the last 4 years, as I mentioned, since the prior reevaluation. We use that data to reassess every property and align the tax assessment value in line with what we believe the market value of that property would be on January 1st of the year, in this case, January 1st, 2023. And the reason we do that is because the way the tax laws are structured in North Carolina, the basis of our tax structure is to establish equitable distribution of value and in accordance with market value on the effective date of a reevaluation. So I've got on this slide the what, when, who, why, and how. So the first thing is when we do a reevaluation, the statute I've got up here, if anyone ever wants to go and read some of that, we go out and place a market value tax assessment at 100% of whatever that value is. Now, why do I say 100%, or why do I make note of that? People, in other states, there are some states that do what they call a millage rate. They may only tax you on 50% of the value. But in North Carolina, it's at 100%. It's just, I say that because we have a lot of people moving into this area. They're familiar and comfortable with what they've dealt with in other places, and yet North Carolina, every state has its own special ad valorem tax law. And so I want to make sure that people understand. So your tax assessment is at 100%. There's not a millage rate assigned to it. I mentioned that the effective date of any reevaluation is on January 1st of the year that it becomes effective, and that is the case here. Every county in North Carolina is required to perform a reevaluation within an 8-year period, and that's every county. Now, in a perfect world, you would reassess every year. Why? Because you're realigning tax assessment with the current market, and that makes straightforward sense. But the resources, the time, and the effort to do an annual reassessment would be overwhelming. It would take 3 times the level of staff because of the amount of data that we process, the amount of work that we have to go through. So in Moore County, what the commissioners have done, they have passed a resolution that we do it every 4 years. And so we've deemed that 4 years is, and I think one day this may move from a state level as more of the standard, that 8 may be lowered to 6 or 4. Because in a 4-year cycle, yes, there can be change. The economy can go up or down, but it won't be as dramatic a change as you most often would experience if you went 8 years between reassessments. So with a 4-year cycle, we last did a reassessment in January 1st, 2019, and now we're doing it for January 1st, 2023. That's our 4-year cycle. And of course, that indicates that the next one will be January 1st of 2027. So how do we do it? Well, we have a pretty substantial assessment system called CAMA, which is Computer Assisted Mass Appraisal, in which we take all the data that we've collected, we put it in, we start going through and reviewing and do all kinds of analytics so that we can consider all the factors about a property, use the sales data in the market, use cost data, what it costs to construct property, and then use all that information to place the market value on that piece of property. So there's a lot of behind the scenes stuff that goes on, but it just takes a lot of time to crunch the data. And we've done this every reevaluation that I've been a part of. We have always, because I mentioned there's only 3,100 commercial properties. So Moore County is not like some of your larger counties. Let's say Wake County, Mecklenburg, some of those that have large commercial bases. So we bring in a consultant on the commercial side to assist us in the commercial. The rest of it we do in-house because no one knows the county better than our staff who is here. We don't farm that out to someone else. So I want people to understand the tax department set these values. And it's pretty important. I'm not ever going to do anything but say we did it and we're confident that we're doing the best job we can do with the data at hand. But with that being said, all the values that we place on these properties are created off of the data that we've collected. We don't use a listing of a piece of property. We use the information that was collected after it's sold. Maybe it's MLS data, stamp value on the deed recorded. We read the whole deed. There can be special proceedings that are involved, whatever the case is. But it's data driven is how we set the value. So what's the goal of a reevaluation? Well, as I mentioned, equitable distribution of value across all properties. And so what I mean by that is if there are two houses that are identical to each other, side by side on the same lot, built at the same time, and I mean identical in every way, then they should be assessed the same. But if there are slight nuances, then there might be a slight difference, but there should be an acceptable comparable range when you're comparing the two. Because we've all heard when we buy and sell property, you determine what you want to sell a property by looking at what other like-in-kind properties sold for, or if you're looking to buy, you're looking at what others have sold and if that's what you want or believe the value of that property is. So it's called equitable distribution of value. And so that's the goal of a reevaluation. And then while we do that, we also are reconciling all of those values to demonstrate what we believe the market value of that property would be on January 1st of the date of the reevaluation, in this case, January 1st of this year. So one of the big things, and I'm not going to read this is the technical jargon, but anyone's more than happy to read that. One of the big things that gets most people's attention and raises the most concern is in a reevaluation, when we send out these notices of value, in this case in Moore County, the average increase in value was 50% this year. It gets a lot of people's attention, and it certainly garners the attention of anyone who may have not looked at buying or selling property in the previous 2 or 3 years, or has no interest in buying any property, just kind of maybe in their forever home. So when this notice shows up and it shows a 50%, a 60%, or a 45% increase, the first reaction is, oh my goodness, my bill's going to go up that amount. That's not absolutely the case. What has to happen is there's what's known as the publishing of a tax neutral rate. What that means is, and I'm going to be very simplistic, again, I'm not going to read this whole thing. In a basic kind of way, with the new assessment value, overall for the whole county, what would the rate need to be adjusted to generate the same type of revenue in total that you did the previous year? And in Moore County, that would mean in this year that the revenue neutral rate would be a lower rate. It's an offsetting. I've got an example here I'm going to show you that'll help to better illustrate what I'm talking about. So on the board here, you can see on the left-hand side, tax year 22. So we have a piece of property that's worth $150,000. That's what the tax assessment value was last year. And by the way, these are this is an example. There's no connection to anything actual at this point, but You have three components of every piece of property from a tax rate standpoint. You have the county rate, overall rate that's applied to all properties. You have the ALS, which basically is the ambulatory response for the entire county. And then a property, if you're in a city, you have the municipal rate. If you're not within a municipal or a town, you have the fire service district rate. Those three components are the rates. And you can see, I just made examples of, and the county rate on the example for 2022 is actually 48.5 cents per hundred. I went ahead and divided by 100. That's why there's the extra decimals there. But the ALS rate would be 4 cents, and the town or fire district, and I used fire district in this case, would be 10.5. So that cumulative rate would be 63 cents per $100 of value of the property. When you multiply that, that creates a tax bill of $945. So when you take the concept and the tax revenue neutral rate discussion, and you look at a reevaluation year, 2023, the property value went up. It went up to $200,000. All right. So what is going to be a tax neutral rate? The county rate on the right-hand side, you can see, would be reduced to 33.5 cents, the ALS to 3.5, the town to 8. Comes up to a cumulative of 45 cents per hundred. And basically I didn't get it perfect because it runs so many digits out to the right in my example, but I just kind of rounded. That creates a tax bill of $940. What that means is even though the property value went up to $200,000, there were the tax neutral rates, which have to be published. They're made aware to the public by the county and or the municipalities. This would demonstrate what those neutral rate would do. It's simple multiplication mathematics in that they're not trying to grab additional money. They've got to get back from a budgetary standpoint at a starting point to understand with the new assessments where they're going to go. And so we wanted to make sure that we kind of demonstrated that, because the first reaction most people have is, my bill is going up. Not necessarily. I like to point out too, now we're fortunate that values have increased because the number one asset owned by most people is their home. And you want your home to maintain value and so on and so forth. But you can have the opposite in an economy, and we experienced some of this back, if you remember, in 08, 09, 10, where values went down. If you do a reassessment in a downturn and property values, let's for easy math, they went down 50%, your tax revenue neutral rate would be double. It's an offset. So it's just a balancing point. That's what I want people to understand. And what is that number used for? It's used in the budgetary process by both the county and at the municipal or town level to understand how to put their budget together for the following year. They've all got obligations, services that are provided, and they have to have a starting point to understand how to put that together. I'm going to skip so once we've done, we've talked about revenue neutral rate, and I want to explain it so people understand the tax bill side. When people received their reevaluation notice, there was a lot of information on that notice about if you have a question or concern, or you think that assessment value is not what the market value of your property is, then you certainly have the right to appeal. So what is the appeals process? It's a three-stage process. There's an informal, formal, and then there's the Property Tax Commission, which is actually beyond the local level. It goes to the state. And so informal appeal, if you look at that form, and by the way, all of this information is also on our website. You can call our customer service. We have 3 people Monday through Friday sitting at desk waiting to take your calls. Or we have direct email. However, the doors are open to our building right there in Carthage. But if you have questions about wanting to appeal, then we're an open book. And we've got people here in the room today too, as we finish the discussion part, open up Q&A. If you've got questions, we want to be able to try and answer them if we can. But we do an informal process, which means we've sent the values out. Someone has come to us and said, Gary, I don't think my house is worth $375,000. I think it's worth $325,000, and here's why. Okay? To me, that's just communication. This is a process. We want the value to be right. What I mean by that is no one knows their property better than the person living on the property or the owner. There will be things about your personal property that you live in that only you know. The tax department may have in the past when we first listed the property. We got the square footage right. We knew how many bathrooms are there. We knew what year it was built and so on and so forth. But if something has transpired after that that affects value, referring back to some of those, like the nuances for land or building, if we're not aware of that, then it may not have been included in the process of setting the value. So if there is a problem there, or if you've modified the property and we're not aware of it, we do get copies of every permit that's gone through the county, and all of the towns who have their own permitting department send us copies so that we can go out, have an appraiser review, and list that change in the property for the taxpayer, even though it's just a convenience. And that way we have the latest and most up-to-date information in our system. And what I mean by that is, let's say you had a standalone building in the back that just wasn't meeting your needs and you tore it down. If we're not aware of it, how would we know to take it off the tax assessment? Now, if a permit's pulled to remove it, that's a clear indication. But that's something we might not know. Same time, if someone enclosed an open porch, they did it themselves, very handy at what they do. But we don't know about it, that actually does influence the value of that piece of property, and we're not aware of it. So when the appeal process starts, it starts as an informal process, which means the taxpayer, the property owner is coming and talking to us. They're submitting us information that says, I believe my value is this as compared to what the tax department has said. And here's why. We'll take that information. We'll send an appraiser out to the property. We do go to each of these properties because we will 100% the property. We don't want to miss anything that in addition to the discussion at hand. We want to make sure we have everything right. We'll send an appraiser out. That information is brought back in. The changes or the information is updated, and if it leads to a change in value, it takes place right then. The new notice of value is sent right then and there. Very simple. As you move forward through the dates, you move into what's known as a formal appeal process. And what is that? Well, on May 1st of this year, a special board called the Board of Equalization and Review comes into session. At that point, and this is, again, every county follows these state guidelines, only that board can make changes to value. And it requires that you go before the board, or at least you submit information and we will present it to the board for you. They can then make changes in value. From May 1st until June 22nd this year, our board will be in session. And so after we get past the informal phase, every appeal coming in, we still send an appraiser out to visit the property, take a look at it, meet and interact with the people or the property owner. But then the board has to review and take a look at it. Now, who's that board made up of? So in February every year, the commissioners reappoint. We have 5 members on the board, and we right now have 1 alternate. Sometimes we have 2. These are people in the community. There's our current board is made up of a former commissioner who is an appraiser. We have 2 other appraisers, fee appraisers, the people you would go to if you wanted your property valued, and 2 real estate people that have sold. One's semi-retired and one is currently still real estate. So they're pretty knowledgeable of the marketplace itself. I think we're very fortunate to have that kind of experience on that board. They sit and listen, and whatever decision they make about value, what is determined, that's what it is. They're unilaterally empowered at that point. And Moore County has a special board, whereas some counties may actually do it at the commissioner level, but Moore County has allocated this special board to, in their stead, make those decisions. So I want to describe what that is. So that's when you go to the formal Board of Equalization and Review. And the third step, even from a decision at the formal level or at a local board, there is complete due process built in. You can appeal a local board decision onto the next level. I always want to put it in a slideshow because one time I didn't and someone says, what happens next? And I want to make sure people know. The Property Tax Commission is at Raleigh, and it is a separate state group that does and oversees the same thing that your local board does. Again, complete due process at all points. So with informal appeals, as I mentioned, any appeal we receive up until basically, we've got April 28th this year because after April 28th, we wouldn't be able to visit it and make a decision before the board's in session. And by statute, when they are convened, I can't touch the value. So that's, we got up till April 28th to get us one. As of May 1st, it goes from informal to formal. Now, between now and then, we still have some tax workshops like this one here, where we're meeting with groups and talking with them and letting them know what we've done, how we've done it, and then answer questions or concerns. Now, I've taken a lot of information that was on a slide like this. For the last 3 weeks, we've been at the Agricultural Center in Carthage. We've, from 9 to 3:30 each day, had up to 5 appraisers just sitting there with full access to everything for anyone to walk in, no appointment necessary. And we've spoken with a lot of people. Some people did go on to appeal, and we're processing those. Some we were able to show all the information that we used in setting these values, meaning the sales data and this, that, and the other. And they learned about the process and they said, okay, I understand, and that makes more sense. Sometimes education goes a long way to letting people understand as to how a tax assessment is set and what's going on. But we've got 4 more workshops, and you can see here on the screen, these are workshops designed that are after hours. I mean, like, we're here on a Saturday, and that's great, but these are from 3:30 to 7:30 at these various locations. We try to spread them all the way around. We've had one in Pine Bluff, we've had one in Cameron, and now we've got these remaining 4, and along with the one here today. So again, no appointment necessary. If you live in Pine Bluff and you want to go to Robbins, it's fine. It's open to whoever, any Moore County citizen or property owner. So when you go to formal appeal, what happens next? Well, as I mentioned, every appeal after April 28th that we get is going to go before the board. It has to. They're the only group by statute that can make changes to property value. The tax department has no statutory authority after that point to make on its own a change in value. I talked about the 5 members of the board, and we have, like I said, 1 alternate. Sometimes we have 2. And what happens is all of the meetings that go before the board are by appointment only. We set those appointments up, and there's multiple days of this board meeting. So we try to accommodate as best we can when someone can come. If someone cannot go to the board, if they're, we all have busy lives, the tax department will still provide to the board the full information. It's not required that you be there. We encourage, if you can, to be there because it's an open discussion about value. And no one knows the property better than the person that owns it or is appealing it. But if you can't, we still present that information and let the board have a full discussion and understanding about why the appeals come in and what's going on. And they'll make a decision, and due process is again still continued because you'll get a decision from that board, which continues to open up the state level if necessary at that point. So here is kind of a quick breakdown, our formal appeal dates. All of the formal appeals, once we go into that phase, will be held between 9 and 3:30. You can see all the dates I told you all the way through June 22nd, which is the adjournment date of that board, will be there. All of the appointments to go and meet the board, we make appointments so that we don't have 100 people show up and not have the appropriate time for that person to sit down and discuss comfortably and easily with the board. The key to understand about this is once this board adjourns, and it will do so on June 22nd, that ends the ability of, certainly, we've already ended the ability at that point for the tax department to make a change. It ends the ability to appeal a property value for this current year. Doesn't mean that next year, I've had people say, man, I should have appealed last year. Well, it's in August and that had already adjourned. Well, the next January, you can appeal again. You're not limited for 4 years. But in this current year, that ended the ability to appeal that value. So that's kind of a brief overview of what we do, the revaluation we're going on, the process of appeals. But then one thing that I wanted to mention before we left is a lot of times when we go through a reevaluation, a lot of people are contacting our office and find out a lot of good information about things they may not have been aware of. There are tax exclusion and exemption programs that could be available, and if someone qualifies, could provide them some type of relief. Now, you have to turn in an application. You have to meet certain eligibility requirements, but by all means, it doesn't hurt anything to it's a one-time application. It doesn't hurt anything at all to submit an application if you think you may be qualified. Ms. Denning in the back, she's got all of that information right there in front of her. And what I'm referring to, you may have heard the Homestead Exemption Program for elderly and disabled. So the elderly exemption program requires that you be 65 years or older and meet a certain income threshold, that you're not over that threshold. If you're disabled, you have to meet certain You have to validate through paperwork that you're 100% disabled. There's a process you go through. I have disabled veterans. If you are service-connected, 100% deemed disabled by the Veterans Administration, there is a $45,000 reduction in assessment value that you can have off of your program. And so there's some programs out there to provide tax relief for individuals that meet these criteria. I'm a firm believer if you meet the criteria, then you should receive the benefit. But if you don't apply, we don't know, because those are private live details that we wouldn't know. So I encourage anyone, either today, we've got takeaway information, Laura can answer your questions. If that's something you think maybe yourself or someone you know might be eligible for, get that information. Now, everything I've talked about here today is available on the county website. But on top of that, you can call us. It's a simple number to remember, 2255. I would hope you could remember that. We have higher volume calls at some point, and you may be asked to stay in a phone queue, but there are 3 people answering these calls. And a lot of times, the person you speak with the first time will take care of it right then and there. If it's a more detailed question, we may transfer it to appraisal, transfer it to listing, transfer it to other departments within us so that we can get you in front of the person that you need. Our doors are always open. We are the building in the circle in the center of Carthage. The first floor and the lower floor is all tax. You're welcome to come in, no appointment necessary. So we try to be as open and transparent on everything. All the information that I've given you is available on the website. If you go to moorecountync.gov, and that's the overall county page, and click on Tax Department, it says Departments of Tax, there actually is a section at the top that feeds in to the appeal form, to the sales data that we used when we were establishing values for this reassessment. There's a copy of a brochure, and we have also brought copies of those. This is the same brochure that was put in the pilot about a week or 2 before revaluation was noticed out. It's just an informative thing. Again, restating a lot of what I said here this morning. And so, and then it also mentions the dates of those after-hour workshops and where and how you can do an appeal. So in summary, there's one other thing too. If there are nonprofits, I forgot to make sure I mentioned that Laura also handles, if you're a nonprofit and you, there's certain forms you turn things in to exempt property taxes and this, that, and the other. She handles all that as well. There's a wide variety of the different things that we do. So I think I used up 5 more minutes, Rachel, than I was supposed to. That clock is pretty daunting back there. But at this point, that was what we were asked to do, is just kind of give a general presentation. And I can either open it up for questions or certainly turn it back over to Rachel.
Thank you so much, Gary. So now we'll do Q&A. And like I said, if you have a question, if you could raise your hand and I'll bring the mic to you.
Thank you for that presentation. Very, very good information. I have 2 questions. You mentioned something about the tax neutral rate? And I think you mentioned that it's published. Can you specify when and where we can get that information? And then second question, under that tax neutral rate, there were 3 different areas that were sort of percentages to help you determine where that rate was. Does Moore County Tax Department set those rates, or which entities set those rates?
So tax neutral rate has to be published. That's in the statute. So I work directly for Moore County, so I'm under Moore County. As I mentioned, let me go back to my example here. You notice there were 3 individual rates. Well, 2 of those rates, if you're in a municipality, only 2 of those rates are set by Moore County. The 3rd rate would be set by the town. If your property is outside of a town, then all 3 of those rates are set by Moore County. And a lot of it boils down to the fire service district coverage is what it is. Because in cities, they cover that component. If you're not in a city, then there's the tax component of that because you're in the rural area of the county. But let me go back and show you, because it's a good question. So those 3 rates, and you can see county rate, county ALS, whatever. The tax department does not set those rates. What happens is, as this example demonstrates, so we send out all the reassessment values, I said 3rd week in March, and very shortly thereafter, earlier than in most years, the tax department then provides to county administration and to all the municipalities what these new assessment base dollar amounts are. Because that's what those entities, whether it's the county or a municipality, use to then determine, well, what the tax neutral rate is, but then also what the ultimate rate is that they're going to put in place. It's not a rate that the tax department. So in generating a tax bill, and again, I mentioned earlier, that's where most people, that's the concern, that's the initial reaction, is that the tax department sets assessment value in accordance with market value on the effective date of the reval. We then provide that information out to the entities that are setting a tax rate, county or municipality. They then publish from that initial discussion what the tax it's too close, what the tax rate would be, and then they determine with all the services that they provide what the tax rate will be, and that becomes a decision. In this case, I was able to, and I'm on the budget task force with Moore County, I think because I provide all the numbers, that's all I do really, but that being the case, the county commissioners early on have said, we are going to seek from the county's rate establishment to be equal or below the tax neutral rate. And so they have just recently, and they stated this in an open meeting, so I got permission to say this before I came here. Their current proposed budget rate is just barely under 1 cent below the tax neutral rate. But I need to translate that into an understanding so people can quantify it. The overall value increased in Moore County by 51.47% if you want the absolute technical number. If your property assessment went up 51.47% and the county's, that proposed rate is what follows, and it's just under 1 cent lower than the tax neutral rate, your tax bill will be slightly less than it was last year. If your tax assessment went dramatically, didn't go up over 51.4%, then it definitely would be lower. If it went up 65%, it'll be slightly higher, but not in direct correlation with the increase in the assessment value. Am I slowly answering your question here? So what happens is I can only speak for what the county does. I know we have, the manager, Parsons here. They do the same thing. And so everyone will, and I don't want to speak for any of the towns at all, but I can say that the commissioners at this point are clearly focused on making sure that they adjust the rate to adjust the impact in line. So, and
I'm happy to address it from a town perspective. Good morning, everyone. Thank you. Am I on? Okay. Sorry, I wasn't getting any feedback. Reagan Parsons, Town of Southern Pines, Town Manager. Let me very quickly thank Gary and his staff for coming out here this morning. 99 other counties in the state. I've been working with his office, and it was Wayne Vest was actually his predecessor for almost 19 years now, and I wouldn't trade him for any one of the other 99. They're really that good, and I think you see from his demeanor this morning, very easy to talk to, very informative, very educational. To go back to your question of when that gets printed, technically it gets printed with the budget document. That will be part of the evening that the council comes in, and we actually hold 2 public hearings here in Southern Pines. The first will be in May, the second will be in June prior to adoption. I can tell you what that is right offhand. There's actually a spreadsheet that we utilize. The School of Government publishes it. We utilize it along with every other municipality across the state of North Carolina. And the reason for the spreadsheet is the revenue neutral calculation can get very complicated. You noticed the definition that Gary put up here, and there's actually a science behind it that removes lands and growth that occurred during that 4-year period, and you arrive at an average growth rate that then has to be removed from that. And again, we could spend an entire semester probably going through the math behind it. But the bottom line is on that spreadsheet, the revenue neutral rate for the town of Southern Pines, with the current tax rate being 40 pennies per 100 valuation, 40 cent, is 0.2815 or 28.15 pennies. We round that up. We'll print the 28.15. That gets rounded up to 29 cents in most cases, in that all of this appeal stuff that Gary's talking about. It is actually the fact that upon appeal, you could see a value go up as opposed to come down. More often than not, if somebody gets their number and they feel like they're lower than what they should be, more often than not, they're not going to come to Gary's office and say, please increase that. Unless for some reason they're going to the market with it and they think that number might mean something to someone. Generally speaking, as a result of appeals, there will be value that comes off of that aggregate number that Gary's office provides to us. And sometimes we don't learn of that number until after the whole state process ends, which I believe is like December is their deadline. So it's well after the passing of the budget. We actually had a local occurrence here just a few years back where a large commercial property that's kind of doing this across the country actually got the state to drop their multiple sites across the state significantly. Southern Pines actually had, I think it was $40,000 or $45,000 held back the following year so that that entity could be reimbursed based upon a state decision. So we use 29 because in all likelihood that 2815 will truly be a little higher than that once all of the appeals take place. Just sat through a budget meeting with the council this past Wednesday. And we are currently working with a budget that will set the tax rate at 29 pennies. So if you follow the pilot, there are local communities that you're going to see additional pennies placed above what their revenue neutral number is, and that can make an awful lot of sense. We've all got inflation in our own homes. We know what things cost. I can tell you that the services, various services that the town provide, we have those same inflationary pressures. So what it cost to do a project last year, more often than not, it's costing a lot more to do it this year just to provide the same services. But that is a 29-cent rate. So like Gary pointed out, the growth or the number or percentage in Southern Pines is 46% across the board. So if you're sitting here today and you know you've got a number that's 50% higher than it was before, you're going to see a little bit of growth in that tax bill from the town. If you're sitting here and you're at 42%, you're actually going to pay a little bit less when it's all said and done, at least to the town. And again, it sounds like to the county also. None of this is finalized until the budgets are adopted in June and go into place July 1. But I think it's also important to remember, because I've had a couple conversations this week, and it's a very complicated sort of deal, but just because that budget gets adopted in June and goes into place in July, the tax rate that is adopted is what will be applied to the new value that you received. There's a lot of, I spoke with a lady who was very upset because she said, no, I've already got this value. I'm going to pay 40 cents against it because you're not going to pass a rate until July. It doesn't work that way. It's the rate that the council passes and puts in place July 1 is retroactive to the January 1 date that he is setting. So that, as it stands right now, will be 29 pennies here in Southern Pines, which again, a lot of people won't see a lot of difference. Another thing just to keep in mind, if you are somebody that pays into an escrow, and Gary and I were just having this conversation before the meeting, if you're somebody that pays into an escrow and your mortgage company sends you a notice every year with a recalculation, your immediate reaction to an increase in that, especially in a year like this, might be that, oh, that's that valuation and my tax went up. Also remember that for most people, that escrow includes your insurance. And we've both seen instances where people have called very upset, and once we walk them through it and they take a look at it, they had to call their State Farm or Nationwide or whomever agent, and they found out that, oh, my home insurance went up pretty significantly. So it's not always going to be the result of the reval or the tax rate that will change that escrow, just as another thing to keep in mind. So much shorter version of a very long answer. It will get published with the budget document itself per the general statute, but as we stand right now, and short of Gary calling me next week and saying, we had this massive appeal, and by the way, you lost a lot of value, it's 28.15 or 0.2815 or 0.002815, just depending on how you want to display it. So.
Questions?
Thank you. Hi. I have a comment and a question. The comment is, it's a complicated subject, and most homeowners, I'm sure, will panic when they got their revaluation, because there's no explanation in there. And the lag between the revaluation information and the millage setting by the town and the county is significant, and the deadline for getting in an appeal is now, essentially. So that's problematic, and maybe down the road, somebody can think about a way of including some additional information, because I'm guessing you're going to get more calls about this. My question is, the tax neighborhood process, is the revaluation all done in-house with data? And then you send an appraiser out only if there's an appeal and there's a question about, a homeowner disagreeing with the revaluation? Is it all done in-house?
It is, there's several moving parts to that. So in North Carolina, if they want to report, in North Carolina, you have what's called an automatic, in North Carolina, you have what's called as an automatic listing system. And so when a house is first picked up onto the tax assessment, then it's automatically relisted the next year, unless an appraiser has gone out because a permit or a modification has happened to the property. We do, on every permit we receive, go visit the property, and it's so that we have the best information, the current information in our tax records when we're doing an assessment. And that's, it's very straightforward and simple to understand. If someone bought a vacant piece of property, they pull a permit to build a house, we go measure and pick up the house for them. And then if 2 years later, they wanted to add on to that house, they'd pull a permit, we'd go out there and we'd pick up the permit. Because as I mentioned, we get copies of all the permits issued by the county, and then we're provided permits by Southern Pines and all the other entities and towns that have their own permitting process. So yes, we go out and list the property, and yes, we either initially send an appraiser out, and then if someone comes in and appeals a property, they've got their 23 notice, they have a question or concern, they want to appeal, they say, no, it's not worth $400,000, I think it's worth $350, and here's why. We take that information, but everything we do is data driven, and on top of that, we visit that property. We would send an appraiser out and say, yeah, I spoke with the owner and they say that it's worth $350, not $400, here's why. All right, let's double check, make sure we got everything right, in addition to the discussion about what information that owner may have provided. If we think we need to remeasure the house just in case, we will. Because as I mentioned, there can be properties, maybe you're not the original owner of the property, you bought it from someone, but the original owner did something or modified it, we were never known because a permit wasn't pulled. We want to make sure we understand fully every time we address it. Now, and I mentioned in a perfect world of reevaluation, every year you would reassess, but the amount of data you'd have to review, the amount of visits you'd have to do, that's impractical and economically impossible, basically. So we do go out to these properties, and for everyone we visit probably 400 to 4,500 properties a year just on permit generation alone. Currently, we have between 700 and 800 appeals that have been filed, and we're visiting them. And we'll go to we have people call up and say, hey, just out of the blue, not even, just in a normal non-reval year, and say, I don't think my square footage is right. Can you come out and double check it? Yeah, we'll do that. We'll go through that. We'll treat it as an appeal because we want paperwork showing when we were requested to come out and look at it, but we'll go through and do all that. Referencing the timeline, you're right. There's a challenge in the timeline of information involved in a reevaluation. We do everything we can. Of course, we have the information on the website. We do put those flyers in the paper. We post it again for people to see. We included in our notices of reevaluation this year some information that we felt was the most informative to this point. We established an email-only address for the convenience of someone to send in, and it's on that notice you got, 2023 reevaluation at moorecounty.nc.gov. You could send it, take your snapshot, whether it's a picture or a scanned document. You can fill out the form and include any other information and get it to us. So we're trying to remove all the barriers. With respect to the budgeting process, which is when the millage rate is set, this year, in a reval year, we've got those numbers to the towns, and Reagan, you would agree, as early as we've ever gotten them. And we did build in some type of an adjustment and understanding of we don't know the volume of appeals. There used to be a rule years ago, and that rule is not quite as standard. It used to be called 10-10-10. When you did a reevaluation, 10% of the total number of parcels would informally appeal. In Moore County, that'd be 7,000 appeals. 10% of those would go on to your Board of E&R. That's 700 appeals. And 10% of those would go on to the state. Now, that has changed over time, and I think it's because the access to information, more transparency, certainly much more informed and educated people who are owning property, more aware of the process and the system and what property is selling for. And so we were prepared for several, 2,500 to 3,000 appeals. That's what we estimated. We're between 700 and 800 now. I think we may double that. I don't know. It's hard to tell, but they're trickling in, and we're addressing them and visiting every one of those properties. Because informally, we want to make sure we get all the information right, and we will never have a property go to the board without having visited the property, because we want to make sure our data is right. Now, we'll take the additional data provided by the property owner and use that in consideration too, but we think it's the service we need to provide so that, again, I mentioned equitable distribution of value, meaning we 100% your property and anyone else's, so that we're treating everyone the same and doing it by the book, as they say, and doing it right. So does that help to answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
And just to follow up with the equitable, you don't need to bring that to me, Rachel.
Okay.
Equitable distribution, I think everybody can hear me.
Okay.
Equitable distribution. Oh, okay.
All right, well, here we go.
Sorry.
That's fine.
In terms of the equitable distribution, and you made a point of indicating that you tax by neighborhood, or is it true that you try to be consistent within a neighborhood group?
Yes. Yes, and the reason I always make a point to a tax neighborhood, as it may be more commonly defined as I live in a general neighborhood by just people talking about it, is because we do group like and kind properties together. I mean, right off the top of my head, I can tell you, like CCNC, that's a gated community. Most people would say, oh, he lives in the CCNC neighborhood. Within that CCNC, there's 3 distinctive different types of land that's out there. There are some 5-acre tracts in the back portion of that, multiple 5-acre tracts. Then there are some East Lake, which have these small non-traditional houses as compared to the rest of the development, smaller, on little water, and just been built in the last 10 or 15 years. And then you have the houses that are on, I don't know, 3/4 of an acre lot or an acre lot or less, and more traditional. We break those up because you can't really value, from a land standpoint and a general standpoint, a house in one community that sits on 10 acres compared to one that sits on 3/4 of an acre, considered one that sits on a 1/4 acre and is more of the townhome type approach, even though they're not connected. Does that help to define what you're talking about? So that's exactly what we do. Yes, ma'am.
I have 2 questions. One is,
We got to get our viewers at home.
thank you. I have 2 questions. One is, can a person appeal after July 1st or, that period of time?
So you can appeal all the way up until June 22nd in this year. Every year, January 1st, the appeals process opens up again. I mentioned that if someone didn't appeal this year for whatever reason, and then in late October they think, oh my goodness, I should have appealed. Send your appeal in then. It will be effective for next year. We'll keep a record of it, or we'll call in, we'll put you on a list, and we'll make sure we send you the appeal form, because we have to update those. You can appeal later. But in the current year, the way the statute is, appeals processes opens up January 1st. It's informal, meaning it's just between the tax department and the property owner until our Board of Equalization and Review comes into session. That'll be May 1st of this year. From May 1st until June 22nd, any appeal received goes before the board. They're the only group that can make value changes. But any appeal received after January 22nd it will go for the next year. It won't be effective for this year. And it ties it, what'd I say? Yeah, that'd be bad. Yeah, June 22nd, I'm sorry. I guess I'm talking too much here. And the reason is it ties back into what Reagan and all the other town managers are doing, and the county from a budgetary standpoint. Those values have to be locked down at some point, and that kind of feeds into it. We talked about the appeals process and the impact. So does that, okay, sure. You got more questions, sir?
Yeah, thank you. That's helpful. I didn't know if you could only appeal during a reevaluation year. And then my second question is with regard to the programs that you mentioned. You mentioned there's one for homeowners that are over 65 that are at an income threshold. Right. And is that a yearly application or is it every cycle or? Okay.
It is considered a one-time application, and if someone is enrolled in the program, let's say, say someone's 66 years old and they're making under, it's $33,800, that's at the state level, then they qualify. And they put the application in, and you have to send them some supporting information. We can't just accept, yes, I make less than that. Well, we have to validate and document. So we put them in the program. You're in the program. Now, we are required, like every 4 to 6 years, we send out an audit request saying, has any of this changed? Because you can have a situation where someone, yes, is underneath that income threshold, but then they went back to work or they did something different and now they're making $40,000 a year. Well, that disqualifies them and they would come out. So to get back in the program, if they, after that, go and meet the eligible, they'd put another application in. But once you're in the program, it's deemed to be a one-time application program. It's not something you annually keep reapplying. It's our job after you're initially in the program to then audit and make sure that everyone's compliant. And the biggest reason we do it is if a lot of people may be in the program. Let's say, unfortunately, someone passes away, they're in the program. We might not know that they passed away, and the heirs the next year get the benefit of that. Well, that's not legally correct. We then have to go back and bill for that. That's by statute what we have to do. And we would catch that in an audit. And we feel that between 4 and 6 years, most time we do find out because we get death certificates and people come in. We see when a property moves from a person's name into an heir situation, and I believe y'all had a big discussion about heir properties before. That's the first thing that Laura would do is send out a notification letter to the heir saying, this property is going to come out because we don't have, the person that did qualify is no longer a part of the ownership. There's some other things too, and I won't get into all these details. It has to be the resident that you live, the residence that you are living in. And if you're getting if you're someone that has a home in another state and you're getting a benefit, you don't get it here. I didn't get into all those details, and Laura can answer any of those questions. And there's takeaway pamphlets there, and the information's on the website. So we're clearly open. Do you have any other questions or? Okay.
I just want to piggyback on that. You said that you have a veterans disability program. Do the veterans have to be 100% disabled?
Yeah, so that program through the state says that you have to be 100% deemed 100% disabled by the Veterans Administration. There's some documentation that they provide, and you turn that in with the application. And what that program does is offers, let's say your property's $345,000, it's a straight reduction of $45,000 off of the taxable base. So if someone qualifies for that, and their full assessment is $345,000, we then only tax them on $300,000. It takes that amount off. One thing I need to let you know too about the homestead, which is a little different, that is up to, what is the number right now, Laura? 50% or what? All right, $25,000 or 50% of the value of the property, whichever is greater, is the relief that's provided through the Homestead Act that we're talking. On the veterans, it's just a minus $45,000. I can only tell you that I've sat in some committee meetings and stuff. There's a lot of talk at the legislative level, again, that's in Raleigh, about bringing programs like that to more mirror the kind of program that the homestead exemption is. There's a lot of discussion, and again, they're in session. I'll have to wait and see what they do. That's all I can do at this point. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
I'm just curious, when you encounter successful appeals versus unsuccessful appeals, what are some common denominators amongst the successful appeals? Or, because when I got my revaluation, I looked at it and it was pretty consistent with what was going on with comps in our neighborhood, and it just in what you've described about the data-driven approach. For me, I'm this is a curiosity question for me personally, really, because I just looked at it and said, yeah, that's about right. They did a good job. But I'm curious, when you do see appeals and something comes across your desk and it surprises you, why? What is the situation, and kind of on both sides of it, is successful or unsuccessful?
So when you have a successful appeal, let's start with that. Generally, we've learned more information about the property that we didn't know at the time we were establishing. I mentioned a simple example that, say you live out in the country and you had a standalone building and you tore that thing down, like my grandfather had a big building he tore down. I don't know that he told the tax department that it was gone, so it was remaining on the record. So that when a notice comes out, if that's something like that happened, you're like, wait a minute, I don't think this is right. Well, we go out, oh yeah, the building's gone. We take it off, that's a successful appeal. It'll lower the value. Or let's say, I've seen this before. I've had an appeal come in on a residential home, beautiful looking home. But what you found out is there's this major crack in the foundation, and they've documented, they've had engineers. It's not going to affect the livability or the safety of the structure. You can stay in it, but it would affect the perception of value of a buyer if you chose to sell, because the cost to cure that comes into play. Yes, okay, can we consider that? We can put an influence on that to address that, saying it's not 300,000, we're going to put 275 because we know the cost to cure is 25,000 to fix that. These are just basic things. When an appeal isn't successful, we've had people come in, and you see a lot more of this in a revaluation year because we have an elevated number of appeals come in. A lot of times people come in and say, I have an appraisal. Great, we love an appraisal, a fee appraiser. Maybe it's from refinance, original purchase, whatever the case may be. But we'll start looking at it and like, well, this appraisal was from 2020. Well, that's right, it hadn't changed since then. Look, we'll double check all the data, but if all the square footage, they call it salient data, if all that's correct and our system's correct, and we go out and look at the sales that we used and it's still supporting our value, then that's an unsuccessful appeal. And we're easy to demonstrate that. I mean, of course, we've got some people here that can talk about some stuff like that. But, and I hear this a lot. Well, I'm not going to sell it. So it can't be market value. You can't value it like that. Our task and what we're asked to do is just put a tax assessment value on equal to what the market value is. Do it through equitable distribution of value and use only data that we've confirmed, arm-linked transaction data, to establish these values. So an unsuccessful appeal is if all our data supports the value we have on it. I've had appeals where they say, well, this house is 3,000 square feet, but you're comparing it to a house that's 1,800 square feet, or, there are other better comparables that support our value. It's an education process we walk through and go do that. I hope that's kind of a wide open question, and I was hoping to figure out examples.
That's interesting, because again, I imagine that you have both examples, and I'm curious what some of those, can you give a few more, unless somebody else has got a question, give a few more of successful appeals. Those two examples you gave were pretty interesting.
Well, let's say you had an appeal, you had a pool, and one person builds a pool, we pick up the pool. A few years later, the house is sold. We don't necessarily go out there because the house sold, there's been no permit pulled. We don't just show up on your door, hey, I'm the tax guy, I want to talk to you. That's not going to work very well. But if you ask us to come or a permit's pulled, we certainly will do that. We get an appeal come in and you realize they filled in the pool. Why? Because, there's pros and cons on a pool. Some people love them, some people don't. And there's insurance questions about it. There's all that. We go out, we take the pool off. Now, one thing to keep in mind about a successful appeal, it only has an impact on the value in the year that the appeal takes place. It's not retroactive, but it will be in place going forward in consideration with any additional changes going forward, but it's not retroactive. Because the premise under which property is listed each year is that if there is a change, it's as much incumbent upon the tax department in the automatic listing responsibility as to know what's there, as it is for the taxpayer to make us aware if there's something that we don't have correct. So I tell people there's not retroactivity, but yeah.
Just a quick question, Gary. On an appeal, how does the January 1 effective date come into play? I see something happen around the corner and it's June, but you're setting a value as of January, and a lot can happen in 6 months' time in the market.
A great question. I could have tied this in during my presentation. So the effective date of a reevaluation is January 1st of the year, this year. That means from January 1st or January 2nd of 2019 all the way through December 31st of 2022, we collected all the information, all the data that we're using to do it. We set that value. It's only addressing that one date, January 1st. So the value represents just what we think the value, market value would be on January 1st of that date. If a house sells today, April 15th, which is tax day, how appropriate to have a conversation about taxes day. That sale isn't included in our database, and it'll be used in the next reevaluation, but you can't use today's sales to go back because that's why they create the effective date. Now, a question I'm glad you asked that question. Something else too is, we've averaged just under 1,000 new homes a year being built for several years now in a row. And people say, well, that house wasn't there. How did you value it? Well, here's exactly what we did. I told you we collect cost data, we collect sales data, and we know what it takes to value these houses. So someone buys a brand new vacant lot, say they had $25,000 on the lot, and they build a home for this year. Next year, they built a home. We place a $250,000 value on it. So now it's $275,000 total. They say, well, how do you value that? What we do is we take all of the information about the home, we key it in our system, and our system values it as though it were in existence on January 1st of this effective year for the reevaluation. Why? Because we're trying to maintain equitable distribution of value. And I think that's one of the real solid blocks underneath the way North Carolina does it. And not to get too far off, but I was explaining to Rachel, other states do it different ways. I was using an example that there are some states that if Rachel and I had a house identical to each other, built same time, everything, we're neighbors, we live there. We live there and we pay $100,000 for the house when we first built each of our homes. 20 years later, the state has some capped growth scenarios where it can only go up a certain amount for tax purposes, tax assessment purposes. Here we are, we're paying taxes on a $400,000 valuation, but the actual value of the property might be $2 million if you sold it. Rachel decides to sell. Hey, $2 million, I'm going on to my next adventure. The new owner coming in begins paying taxes on $2 million worth of value. Me, I'm still sitting at $400,000. That is not equitable distribution of value. And that's one of the differences that North Carolina does. So if like-in-kind property, they're valued in accordance as of the same effective date, using the same data, and using comparable properties to do so. Does that hopefully help? Okay. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question about manufactured homes or mobile homes, and the reason is because I'm helping a senior who's a cancer survivor, and he lives in a 32-year-old dilapidated single-wide in rural Vass, and his land value was increased 97%, and his building was increased 135%, which normally, mobile homes, manufactured homes, they decrease in value. So his total assessed value went up 113%, so could you speak to that in terms of manufactured and mobile homes?
Right. So manufactured and mobile homes, we treat mobile homes slightly different than we do manufactured homes. Mobile homes actually always remain on the iron structure underneath. Just to give you a brief history, if people want to know, in order to deem mobile home real property, you have to meet 5 caveats. You have to have the axle, the wheels removed, has to be on a permanent foundation. It has to have the tongue removed that was used in towing, and it has to be the owner of the property and the owner of the mobile home itself have to be in the same name. If you meet those 5 criteria, it can be deemed real property. If you are not meeting those 5 criteria, the mobile home itself is personal property and the land is separate. That's just part of the statute. Manufactured homes actually are brought in, taken off that, and set onto a more permanent foundation. They're much more akin to what a stick-built home, to use a tradition. So in the valuation that you talked about, yes, manufactured, mobile homes, and stick-built, it was across the board was an increase in value. We have sales that indicate that mobile homes or manufactured homes, they also increased in value. Now, the condition, in your example, the condition may be the biggest question mark there. There's an assumption at all times, and I think everyone, there's things called routine deferred maintenance involved with properties, how well someone keeps their property up. We all know that if you've been in a house 30 years, you got to put a new roof on it. Well, we all wait. We didn't set aside money and just slap the new roof on it. We go borrow the money and put the roof on that. But how well you maintain a property is also a vital component into the valuation model that we use. So in the case of the person that you're working with, if it is in a condition that is beyond the reasonable expectation of someone if they were going to go and buy it, I would encourage them to file an appeal. Let us go out and determine. Because if they haven't told us, we wouldn't know. Because we can't go to 37 plus thousand residential properties every year. Hey, we can't do that in 4 or 5 years. I mean, not without increasing our staff to update. So there's a reasonable expectation that everyone's maintaining their property that would be equal to what's expected to be maintained if someone were to sell the property. So yes, there are some significant increases. I've seen some mobile homes selling, on a less than an acre of land, and it be a 1,500 square foot double wide selling for $160,000. 5 years ago, I'd have said, what are you talking about? But there are sales underwriting that. Again, these values are supported by data. We don't use listing, and we don't try to project ahead. We use only the data that we have in hand. So I would encourage, in helping this person, file an appeal. The thing about the appeals process, it's not adversarial to me or my staff. It's informational. It allows us to know what you know about your property. So let us come out. Tell us what you know that we don't, or let us explain to what we have done that you may not be aware of as well. So that's the way I look at that process. So I would encourage, when you leave here, go talk to Mike or Stanley and give them that information. We'll be glad to process that. Any other questions?
Do you have a list of situations that a property owner may want to look at to say, I can appeal what is going on with my property? For an example, if someone didn't know that if they had a crack in their foundation, they could appeal that evaluation, they may miss that.
Right. So I don't know that I could have an all-inclusive list of all the multiple variables that could impact that. I do understand your question. What I would say to answer that question is, in the home that you own or you live in, or that someone you know is living in, if there's something about that home that if you as a prospective buyer were to come up, now you know it intimately, you understand everything, but you were going to come and buy the home, is there something that you would want to address that would be outside your normal expectations? Most people, when they sell a home, the buyer will come in and have a home inspection to uncover, disclose, and make sure everything's fine. If you have a leaking chimney, where the flashing's not working, and it's there, but you've caulked it a few times, but it's an ongoing issue, is that going to be, if it causes damage to the roof structure, surely you want to, you need to figure out, how's that affecting my value? The cracked foundation is a pretty significant one. That's a real life scenario that we came across. But I would just tell people, if you know something about your property that is individual to it, but that if you put a for sale sign on it, the potential buyer would question, that's when you might want to contact us and say, hey, I've got this. How might this affect my valuing if it's considered, and go from there. I hope that. We don't have, again, the appeals process is if you feel like the value is not correct. I don't have a definitive list like that. What you can do, though, we have sales later on our website. You can go out and click, I mentioned going to the tax department, go out to our area, and there's a link of all the sales that you could click on, and it'll highlight in green and yellow all the sales all over the county. We put that out there for people to see. You can say, oh, well, the house down the street, so what did it sell for? Oh, wow, it sold for that. well, that's very comparable to mine. What's my value? You know, you can go and look and see at that. But as far as a list of reasons that you might want to think about having us come out and look at, we don't have a list like that per se. But you can call us at any time. If someone has a question about their property, again, I mentioned we'll go out to your property if you call and ask us to. We don't just show up unannounced. I'll just put it to you that way. We're not going to do that. So, any other questions? Yes, ma'am. Good morning.
Please be kind enough to let me know, how do you assess a property if they have a gate in front of their home and it's locked? How do you manage to do your work? And also a list of the different areas in which you look for when you do assess the property value.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, you know, this question has come up many times, and we have a new process in place. If there's a locked gate, we don't go in it anymore. Now, we've changed that in the last couple of years, where we used to, I say lock gate, a closed gate. We're not going to go in there. When a property is first built, a home, a structure, we measure that property. If a permit's pulled, we would go out, and if they had an addition or a modification, we'll pick up that information. If we can't have access to it, we'll leave a door hanger on the property, asking that property owner to call us back so we can interact with them and understand what's going on. Well, we can attempt to mail a letter, or we can call if we have the contact information. So there's some limitations. I mean, we have now where there's gates around, privacy fences, and they're locked. We don't have access to that. That is another component that people don't realize that the appeal process allows us to address. We do the best we can without being intrusive into your private areas, because we don't want to have to go in everyone's houses. That's not our intent. But at the same time, so we collect the best data we have, we come up with an assessment value, and if we send it, then if there's a concern about it, it may be because we need better data. We then are contacted by that person, and then we'll go out and meet them and have more access internally. Because if you lock your gate, you locked it for a reason, and we're not going in it. So then you asked me, what was the second question was about what data we collect with respect to home? Yeah. So clearly we measure a house to know what the square footage is. We understand and want to know how many bathrooms are in there, the year that it was built. Now, these are the basics. The year that it was built, we make an assessment as to the condition. Again, if it's a house built in 63 and it needs a new roof, we'll document that. If there's new roofs on it, then we appreciate that as it's being maintained and move forward. What area within the footprint of the house is heated and cooled? You know, open deck or a porch, patio, as opposed to the main part. Is there a second floor? If there's dormers on the second floor, is that actually an enclosed attic space or not? So we collect all these features of information, and there's a lot of them. I don't know how many, Mike, how many do you think we have? 100, 150 at least data points that we collect per structure. Mike is our division leader over appraisal and assessment, but that's a rough estimate. So, but all the information we collect allows us to then make comparisons to properties that have sold in order to establish the tax assessment value. Yes, ma'am. Any other questions?
All right, yeah, if you could please join me in giving Mr. Briggs a hand. Thank you so much to the Moore County Tax Department again for being here today. And thank you all for being here today too. And thank you to everybody watching the live stream at home. The tax department has stations set up in the back, so if you have any questions, please go talk to them. But have a great weekend.